In this nugget, we are going to explore the plot and key events of Search for Mr. Hyde from the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. We are told Mr. Utterson's Sunday evening routine is to eat dinner and afterwards read by the fire and go to bed at 12. However, after hearing Mr. Enfield's story, he does not follow his usual routine. The narrator deliberately relates this routine to us, so that when Mr. Utterson breaks his usual habits, we know that something is wrong. Mr. Utterson opens his safe and takes out a private document, Mr. Jekyll's will, in which Mr. Jekyll bequeaths all his possessions to his friend Mr. Edward Hyde. A will is a document that determines what happens to your money and property and possessions after your death. To bequeath something means to give it or to leave it to something or someone else in a will. The document also states that if Mr. Jekyll is to vanish for more than 3 months, Mr. Hyde will step into his shoes. The phrase, "step into his shoes," is an idiom. An idiom is a common or familiar saying which uses figurative language, such as the expression "over the moon" or "a blessing in disguise." This idiom means to take over someone else's role or their position or authority. This is a very unusual clause in a will, because usually a will is for after your death, rather than if you go missing. Previously, the will had made the lawyer indignant because he did not know the man, Mr. Hyde. Indignant describes an emotion that is both angry and annoyed. Now that he has begun to learn what a detestable man Mr. Hyde truly is, the will makes him more worried than ever. To detest means intense hatred, so to be detestable means to be extremely unlikable. He had thought the will was madness, but now begins to fear it reveals some disgrace of Mr. Jekyll. Like Mr. Enfield, he suspects that Mr. Hyde knows some secret wrongdoing of Mr. Jekyll's and is blackmailing him. Wrongdoing means doing something wrong, so doing something bad, dishonest, or even illegal. Blackmail is when one person or a group of people demands money from someone else or another group, or forces them to perform certain actions in exchange for not revealing incriminating information about them. Mr. Utterson goes to visit his friend, Dr. Lanyon. The narrator describes Lanyon. This was a hearty, healthy, dapper, red-faced gentleman with a shock of hair prematurely white and a boisterous and decided manner. The description of Dr. Lanyon's appearance suggests that he is a cheerful and happy character. The link between a character's appearance and their personality is a common trope in Victorian literature. A trope is something that recurs or repeats throughout literature. We are told that Dr. Lanyon welcomes Mr. Utterson heartily and genuinely because the two are old friends from school and college. Dr. Lanyon reveals that he no longer sees Henry Jekyll very often because he feels that Jekyll has become too fanciful and has gone wrong in mind. Fanciful means that someone is being over-imaginative. When Dr. Lanyon says that Jekyll is wrong in mind, he probably means that Jekyll is mentally ill. However, mental illness was not understood as it is today. That night, when Mr. Utterson goes to bed, he tosses to and fro, which tells us he is troubled. First, he imagines the story that Mr. Enfield told him about the man who trampled the child. Later, Utterson imagines his friend, Jekyll, sleeping and awakened by a figure whose bidding he must do. Utterson thinks that if he could only see the mysterious man's face, then this would reduce some of his mystery to him, and consequently his fear. So, he decides to find the mysterious Mr. Hyde and see his face for himself. If he be Mr. Hyde, he had thought, I shall be Mr. Seek. Mr. Utterson begins to haunt the door from Enfield's story, and finally sees the man one night. It is a fine, dry night, with frost in the air, the streets as clean as a ballroom floor. The narrator uses pathetic fallacy. The nighttime setting creates an atmosphere of fear, secrecy, and mystery. Pathetic fallacy is a literary device where writers describe the weather or the setting to reveal how a character is feeling. On this dry, frosty night, Mr. Utterson hears approaching footsteps. The narrator spends some time describing the footsteps of the approaching man to build the tension and suspense. Tension and suspense is the feeling of excitement mixed with nervous anxiety. Writers deliberately build tension and suspense into their stories through mysterious or unpredictable events to make the audience or reader feel more excited. When Mr. Utterson approaches the man and asks if he is Mr. Hyde, Hyde reacts with fear, though it is only momentary, and he is soon behaving in a cool manner once again. Momentary means that something lasts for a moment, a few seconds, or a very short period of time. Mr. Utterson asks to see Mr. Hyde's face, which he shows him. When Mr. Utterson says this will allow him to recognize Hyde in future, Hyde admits that this could be advantageous. This shocks and chills Mr. Utterson because he realizes that Hyde must be thinking of the will. It would be helpful for Jekyll's lawyer to know and recognize Hyde in case Jekyll ever went missing, thereby ensuring that Hyde would inherit his money and property. Mr. Hyde wants to know how Mr. Utterson knows his face, but when Mr. Utterson claims Jekyll has described him, Hyde knows that he is lying. Hyde is described as laughing in a savage way. The other snarled aloud into a savage laugh. The adjective savage describes something wild, vicious, and violent. The adjective savage, therefore, suggests that Hyde is wild, angry, and dangerously out of control. The verb snarled describes an aggressive growling sound made by an animal, or a noise that is made by a person to express anger. Therefore, the verb snarled creates an image of a wild animal, like a wolf, trying to intimidate another animal, implying that Hyde is angry and dangerous. Utterson reflects that Hyde is hardly human. He goes to Jekyll's house and talks to Poole, who is Jekyll's servant. Utterson is ashamed that he feels relieved when he learns that Jekyll is out. He explains that he has seen Hyde entering the old dissecting room, which is the laboratory. Poole confirms that Hyde has a key and is allowed to access the laboratory. Utterson learns that Poole and the other servants all have orders to obey Hyde. Poole says, "We have all orders to obey him." Remember, to gain marks in AO1, you have to show that you remember and understand key events in the novella, so take notes. The following events occur in Search for Mr. Hyde. Mr. Utterson reads Jekyll's will, which leaves everything to Hyde in the event that he dies or goes missing. Dr. Lanyon tells Utterson he no longer speaks to Jekyll. Utterson is troubled by bad dreams and decides to find Hyde. He learns that Hyde has a key to Jekyll's laboratory and that Jekyll's servants have orders to obey Hyde.